The small-town courtroom buzzed with the low murmur of conversations. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some fanning themselves with papers, others glancing at the clock on the wall. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and stale coffee. At the front of the room, Judge Harold Grayson adjusted his glasses and peered over the top of them at the docket in front of him. He tapped his gavel lightly, signaling for everyone to settle down. "Order in the court," he said in a firm but monotone voice. His gaze swept across the room, lingering briefly on a young woman seated near the back. She stood out from the rest. Her outfit was unusual, even by the loose standards of casual dress that had become common in recent years. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and her posture was relaxed yet confident. This was Karoline Leavitt, though no one in the room knew much about her beyond the fact that she was here today because of what she was wearing. Judge Grayson cleared his throat and began reading from the docket. Case number 427B, State v. Karoline Leavitt. Charges filed under Section 8.3 of the Municipal Code regarding public decency violations. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Leavitt, please step forward." Karoline rose from her seat without hesitation. She walked to the center of the courtroom, her movements smooth and unhurried. As she approached the bench, the murmurs in the room grew louder. People craned their necks to get a better look at the garment in question, a long, flowing piece of fabric wrapped around her body in an intricate pattern. It wasn't exactly revealing, but it wasn't conventional either. Some might have called it artistic, others would say it was eccentric. Either way, it had caught the attention of local authorities. Edward Miller, the prosecutor assigned to the case, stood up and straightened his tie. He was a tall man with thinning hair and a perpetually serious expression. Edward prided himself on being thorough and methodical, traits that had earned him a reputation as one of the more reliable attorneys in town. But today, he couldn't help feeling slightly amused by the absurdity of the situation. Still, duty called. "Your Honor," Edward began, addressing Judge Grayson, "the defendant, Ms. Karoline Leavitt, has been cited for violating Section 8.3 of our Municipal Code, which prohibits attire deemed inappropriate or disruptive to public order. The garment in question," he gestured vaguely toward Karoline, "is clearly outside the bounds of acceptable clothing as defined by this ordinance." A few people in the audience chuckled softly, but Judge Grayson silenced them with a sharp glance. "Proceed, Mr. Miller." Edward nodded and turned to face Karoline directly. "Ms. Leavitt, can you explain why you chose to wear this particular outfit in public?" Karoline tilted her head slightly, studying him with calm, intelligent eyes. "Certainly," she replied in a clear, measured voice. "This garment is called a Coss. It's inspired by traditional designs from various cultures and is meant to symbolize unity and creativity. I wore it today because I believe fashion should be a form of self-expression, not something dictated by arbitrary rules." Her response drew a few approving nods from the spectators, but Edward remained unfazed. "While your intentions may be admirable, Ms. Leavitt, the law is clear. Public spaces require certain standards of decorum to ensure safety and maintain order. Your choice of attire does not meet those standards." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "With all due respect, Mr. Miller, the concept of decency is subjective. What one person finds offensive, another might see as beautiful. Are we really going to base legal decisions on personal opinions?" Edward hesitated for a moment before replying. "The law provides objective criteria for determining what constitutes appropriate attire. Those criteria exist to protect the community from potential disruptions." "And yet," Karoline countered smoothly, "there's no evidence that my clothing caused any actual disruption. No complaints were filed by members of the public, and there's no indication that anyone felt threatened or uncomfortable. So why am I here?" Edward opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Grayson interjected. "Enough," he said sharply. "Ms. Leavitt, while your arguments are intriguing, they do not negate the fact that you violated a standing ordinance. Unless you have evidence to refute the charges, I will proceed with sentencing." Karoline didn't flinch. Instead, she gave the judge a polite smile. If it pleases the court, Your Honor, I'd like to address the issue of jurisdiction. Specifically, whether this ordinance applies to me in this instance? Judge Grayson frowned. You may speak, but make it brief. Thank you, Your Honor. Karoline took a deep breath and began speaking in a tone that commanded attention. Section 8.3 of the Municipal Code states that it applies to individuals engaging in activities within designated public areas. However, when I was cited, I was standing on private property, a bookstore owned by Mrs. Clara Hensley, who has kindly provided documentation confirming my location at the time. Furthermore, the definition of public decency outlined in the ordinance is vague and overly broad, raising concerns about its constitutionality. The courtroom fell silent. Even Edward seemed taken aback by the clarity and precision of her argument. Judge Grayson removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. Ms. Leavitt, he said after a long pause, are you suggesting that this entire case is invalid? Not entirely, Your Honor, Karoline replied. I'm simply pointing out that the prosecution has failed to establish a factual basis for the charges. Without concrete evidence of harm or disruption, imposing a penalty would set a dangerous precedent, one that could infringe upon individual freedoms protected by higher laws. For a moment, Judge Grayson looked uncertain. Then, almost reluctantly, he banged his gavel. The court finds the defendant guilty of violating Section 8.3 of the Municipal Code. A fine of $50 is imposed. Case closed. Karoline nodded politely, though there was a flicker of amusement in her eyes. As she turned to leave, she glanced at Edward, who was still staring at her with a mix of admiration and disbelief. Little did anyone know, this seemingly minor incident would mark the beginning of something far greater. Outside the courthouse, Karoline paused to adjust her Coss, letting the late afternoon sun warm her skin. She smiled faintly, already thinking about how she might use this experience to spark larger conversations about freedom, justice, and the power of the law. Edward Miller sat at his desk later that evening, staring at the stack of papers in front of him. The courtroom lights had long since been turned off, and the building was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. He leaned back, in his chair, tapping a pen against the edge of his desk as he replayed the day's events in his mind. Karoline Leavitt's words echoed in his thoughts. Her calm demeanor, her precise arguments, and the way she had dismantled the case against her with such ease, it all left him unsettled. Edward prided himself on being thorough, on knowing the law inside and out. But today, he felt like he'd been outmatched by someone who didn't even call herself a lawyer. He picked up the file he'd created for the case, flipping through the notes he'd jotted down during the trial. There was something about Karoline that intrigued him. It wasn't just her sharp mind or her ability to think on her feet. It was the way she carried herself. Confident, but not arrogant. Intelligent, but approachable. She reminded him of the kind of person he wished he could be more like. Curiosity got the better of him. Edward opened his laptop and started typing her name into the search bar. At first, he didn't expect to find much. People like Karoline, who seemed so unassuming yet brilliant, often flew under the radar. But within minutes, he stumbled upon information that made his eyes widen. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just some random woman who happened to know a thing or two about the law. She had graduated top of her class from one of the most prestigious law schools in the country. Her thesis on constitutional law had won awards, and she had clerked for a federal judge before disappearing from the legal scene entirely. The articles and interviews he found painted a picture of someone destined for greatness, but instead of pursuing a high-profile career, she had simply vanished. Edward leaned forward, his interest piqued. What would make someone with such talent walk away from the profession? And why was she living in this small town, working odd jobs and wearing unconventional outfits that landed her in court? The next morning, Edward decided to pay her a visit. He didn't have a clear plan, only a vague idea that maybe, just maybe, she could help him with something. A civil rights lawsuit he'd been working on had hit a wall, and no matter how many hours he spent poring over case law, he couldn't seem to find a solution. Something told him that Karoline might see things differently. He drove to the address listed in the public records, a modest house on the outskirts of town surrounded by tall trees and wildflowers. As he parked his car and walked up to the front door, he felt a flicker of nervousness. What if she turned him away? What if she thought he was wasting her time? Before he could knock, the door swung open. Karoline stood there, dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, her hair tied back in a loose braid. She looked surprised to see him, but quickly recovered, offering a polite smile. "Mr. Miller," she said, raising an eyebrow. "This is unexpected." "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," Edward replied, feeling suddenly awkward. I wanted to talk to you about something." Karoline crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe. "About yesterday?" "Partly," Edward admitted, "but also about another case I'm working on. I think you might be able to help." She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." The inside of her house was cozy and welcoming, filled with books and artwork. Edward noticed a shelf dedicated to legal texts, their spines worn from frequent use. They sat down at her kitchen table, where she offered him a cup of tea. Once they were settled, Edward explained the situation. "It's a civil rights case," he began. "A group of residents is suing the city over discriminatory zoning laws. We've gathered plenty of evidence, but every argument we present gets shot down. I'm starting to think we're missing something obvious." Karoline listened intently, nodding occasionally as he spoke. When he finished, she set her teacup down and looked at him thoughtfully. "You're right," she said after a pause. "You are missing something obvious." Edward blinked. "What do you mean?" "The problem isn't your arguments," she explained. "It's the way you're framing them. You're focusing too much on proving discrimination and not enough on showing how these laws violate fundamental rights. If you shift the narrative, you'll have a stronger case." Edward frowned, trying to process what she was saying. "How exactly do I do that?" Karoline smiled faintly. "Let me show you." She grabbed a notebook and began sketching out a new strategy, explaining each step in detail. Her ideas were bold, creative, and undeniably brilliant. By the time she finished, Edward felt a surge of excitement and relief. "This is amazing," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Why aren't you practicing law full-time? You could change the world." Karoline's expression softened, and for a moment she looked almost wistful. "I used to think that too," she said quietly. "But the truth is, the legal system isn't always about justice. Sometimes it's about politics, money, and power. I didn't want to lose myself in that." Edward nodded slowly, understanding her point, but still feeling a pang of regret. Someone like Karoline could do so much good if she chose to stay in the game. Still, he respected her decision, even if he didn't fully agree with it. "So," she said, breaking the silence, "what happens now?" "Well," Edward replied, gathering his notes, "if you're willing to help, I'd love to work with you on this case. Not as my client, of course, but as a consultant, I guess." Karoline chuckled. "Consultant sounds official, but sure, I'll help, on one condition." "What's that?" "That you stop calling me Ms. Leavitt. It makes me feel old." Edward laughed, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he felt hopeful about the case and about his own abilities. With Karoline's guidance, he knew they could make real progress. Over the next few days, they met regularly to go over the details of the lawsuit. Karoline pored over the documents Edward brought, asking questions and offering insights that forced him to rethink everything he thought he knew about the case. She challenged him to dig deeper, to look beyond the surface-level facts and consider the bigger picture. At the same, everything wasn't perfect between them. Edward sometimes struggled to keep up with Karoline's rapid-fire thinking, and she occasionally grew frustrated when he hesitated to take risks. But despite their differences, they worked well together. Edward admired her passion and creativity, while Karoline appreciated his determination and attention to detail. One afternoon, as they sat in her living room brainstorming strategies, Karoline suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Wait a second," she said, grabbing a highlighter and flipping through a document. "Look at this." Edward leaned closer, squinting at the page. What am I looking at? This footnote, she said, pointing to a line of text. It mentions a similar case from 20 years ago. The verdict was overturned because the plaintiffs proved that the zoning laws disproportionately affected minority communities. Edward's eyes widened. Are you saying we can use that as precedent? Exactly, Karoline replied, grinning. If we frame our argument around equal protection, we might actually have a shot. They spent the rest of the day refining their approach, mapping out every possible angle and counter-argument. By the time Edward left that evening, he felt more confident than ever. For the first time, he believed they had a real chance of winning, not just for their clients, but for everyone affected by the unjust laws. As he drove home, Edward couldn't help but marvel at how quickly things had changed. Just a week ago, he'd been stuck, unsure of how to move forward. Now, thanks to Karoline, he had a renewed sense of purpose and a partner who inspired him to be better. Meanwhile, Karoline stayed up late that night, reviewing the case materials one last time. Despite her earlier reluctance to get involved, in the legal world again, she found herself enjoying the challenge. Helping others fight for justice reignited a spark she thought she'd lost. And though she didn't admit it to Edward, or even to herself, she was beginning to wonder if, maybe, just maybe, she wasn't done with the law after all. The morning of the trial arrived, and the small-town courthouse was packed with people. Reporters from local newspapers and TV stations crowded the entrance, microphones in hand, eager to capture any soundbite they could. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with nervous energy. Spectators filled every available seat, some whispering among themselves, others watching silently as the proceedings began. Karoline, Edward, and Judge Grayson stood together near the front of the room, their faces calm but determined. Karoline wore a simple yet elegant outfit, a deliberate choice to avoid drawing attention away from the case itself. Her confidence radiated through her posture, even as she glanced around the room, taking note of the mix of supporters and skeptics. At the center of it all was Judge Patricia Monroe, a no-nonsense jurist known for her sharp mind and impartial rulings. She adjusted her glasses and addressed the court. This is a civil rights lawsuit filed by residents alleging discriminatory zoning laws. Counsel, please proceed. Edward stepped forward first, clearing his throat before speaking. Your Honor, we are here today to challenge ordinances that have been used to systematically marginalize certain communities. These laws are not only unjust but unconstitutional, violating principles of equal protection under the law. As Edward outlined the broad strokes of their argument, Karoline watched the opposing counsel, a seasoned attorney named Richard Dawson, scribble notes furiously. Dawson represented the city and its interests, and he wasted no time countering Edward's opening statement. Your Honor, Dawson began, his tone smooth and practiced. The zoning laws in question were enacted to promote orderly development and ensure public safety. They apply equally to all citizens and serve the greater good of our community. Karoline narrowed her eyes slightly, recognizing the familiar rhetoric. It was the same defense she had encountered countless times in her research. Vague appeals to order and safety designed to mask deeper inequalities. When it was her turn to speak, Karoline rose from her seat and approached the podium. The room fell silent as she began, her voice steady and clear. Your Honor, what Mr. Dawson fails to mention is that these so-called neutral laws disproportionately affect minority neighborhoods. For example, low-income families are forced to live in areas with inadequate infrastructure because rezoning applications are routinely denied without explanation. She paused, letting her words sink in. Then, turning to face the gallery, she added, "These policies aren't about protecting anyone. They're about maintaining control over who gets access to resources and who doesn't." Her remarks drew murmurs of agreement from some spectators, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Dawson frowned, clearly unprepared for Karoline's direct approach. He tried to interrupt, but Judge Monroe held up a hand. Let her finish. Karoline continued, presenting evidence they had gathered. Emails showing collusion between city officials and developers, maps highlighting disparities in resource allocation, and testimonies from residents who had suffered under the current system. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture of systemic abuse. Dawson struggled to respond, resorting to generalities and platitudes. While the plaintiffs may feel aggrieved, Your Honor, there is no proof that these laws were intentionally discriminatory. Correlation does not imply causation. Karoline leaned forward, her expression sharp. Intent isn't the issue here. The impact of these laws speaks for itself. Whether intentional or not, the result is the same. Entire communities are being pushed aside to make room for profit-driven projects. Judge Monroe nodded thoughtfully, jotting down notes. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. It was clear that Karoline's arguments were resonating, not just with the judge, but with everyone present. Later that afternoon, the testimony phase began. Karoline called their first witness, an elderly woman named Margaret Hayes, who lived in one of the affected neighborhoods. Margaret recounted how her family had been denied permission to build a new community center, despite meeting all requirements. Her voice trembled with emotion as she described the frustration and helplessness of seeing her neighborhood neglected year after year. Next came James Carter, a young man who ran a small business in the area. He explained how restrictive zoning laws had stifled his ability to expand, forcing him to turn away customers and miss opportunities for growth. His story struck a chord with many in the audience, especially those who owned businesses themselves. As each witness spoke, Karoline guided them gently, asking questions that highlighted the human cost of the policies. By the end of the day, the courtroom felt heavy with shared understanding. Even some of the skeptics seemed moved by the stories unfolding before them. The next morning, Dawson called his witnesses, including several city officials who defended the ordinances. But Karoline was ready. With Judge Grayson's help, she had anticipated their talking points and prepared counter-arguments. When the city planner testified that the laws were necessary for urban renewal, Karoline produced documents showing that most of the funds allocated for such projects ended up in the hands of private developers rather than benefiting the community. You claim these laws are about progress, Karoline said, holding up a chart illustrating the flow of money. But the data tells a different story. Can you explain why nearly 80% of the funding went to companies outside the affected areas? The planner stammered, unable to provide a satisfactory answer. Dawson shot Karoline a glare, but she simply smiled faintly, knowing she had scored another point. By the third day of the trial, tensions were running high. Dawson grew increasingly agitated, his polished demeanor cracking under the weight of Karoline's relentless questioning. At one point, he accused her of cherry-picking evidence, prompting Judge Monroe to intervene. Ms. Leavitt has presented credible facts supported by documentation, Judge Monroe said firmly. If you wish to challenge them, do so with evidence of your own. Dawson flushed red but said nothing further. The tide was turning, and everyone in the room could feel it. On the final day of testimony, Judge Grayson took the stand as a surprise witness. His decision to testify had been carefully planned, and Karoline had coached him on how best to frame his statements. As he recounted his discovery of the ordinance's origins and its misuse over the years, the courtroom fell silent. I've spent decades enforcing laws I believed were just, Grayson admitted, his voice tinged with regret. But I now realize that blind adherence to rules can perpetuate injustice. We must hold ourselves accountable, not only to the letter of the law but to its spirit. His words carried weight, especially coming from someone in his position. When he finished speaking, there was a long pause before the room erupted into quiet applause. Judge Monroe banged her gavel to restore order, though her expression suggested she too was moved. Closing arguments came next. Dawson gave a polished speech, reiterating the city's stance on public safety and orderly development. But when Karoline stood to deliver her closing remarks, the room seemed to hold its breath. This case isn't just about zoning laws, she began, her voice ringing out clearly. It's about fairness, dignity, and the right of every person to live without fear of being pushed aside. The defendants want you to focus on abstract concepts like order and efficiency. But let me remind you of what's really at stake: families losing homes, children growing up in unsafe environments and dreams being crushed under the weight of indifference. She paused, looking directly at Judge Monroe. Your Honor, this court has the power to set things right, to send a message that justice means more than protecting the powerful. I urge you to rule in favor of the plaintiffs, not because it's easy, but because it's right. When she finished, the courtroom remained silent for several moments. Then slowly, people began to clap, breaking protocol but unable to contain their admiration. Even Judge Monroe allowed herself a small smile as she announced that the court would deliberate and issue a ruling within 48 hours. As they left the courthouse, Edward turned to Karoline and grinned. That was incredible. No matter what happens, we've already won. Karoline nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction she hadn't experienced in years. Whatever the verdict, they had exposed the truth, and that alone was a victory worth celebrating. 2 days later, the courtroom was once again filled with people. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone waited for Judge Patricia Monroe to deliver her verdict. Reporters jotted down notes, cameras clicked softly, and spectators whispered among themselves, speculating about the outcome. Karoline sat quietly beside Edward, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She exuded calmness, but inside, she felt a mix of anticipation and determination. This wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about setting a precedent that could ripple far beyond this small town. Judge Monroe entered the room, her expression unreadable as she took her seat. The murmurs in the gallery faded into silence as she adjusted her glasses and began to speak. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, she said, her voice steady and authoritative, this court finds in favor of the plaintiffs. The zoning laws in question are hereby declared unconstitutional due to their discriminatory impact and violation of equal protection rights. A wave of gasps swept through the room, followed by cheers from supporters. Some people hugged one, another, tears streaming down their faces. Others clapped loudly, celebrating not only the victory but also the hope it represented. Judge Monroe raised her hand to quiet the crowd before continuing. In addition to striking down these ordinances, the court orders reparations for affected communities. Funds previously allocated for private development projects will now be redirected toward improving infrastructure, housing, and public services in marginalized areas. Furthermore, an independent oversight committee will be established to ensure transparency moving forward. When she finished speaking, the applause erupted again, louder this time. Karoline exchanged a glance with Edward, who looked both relieved and exhilarated. Judge Grayson, seated near the front row, nodded approvingly, his earlier doubts replaced by pride in what they had accomplished together. In the days that followed, news of the ruling spread quickly. National media outlets picked up the story, highlighting the unlikely team behind the victory: a former prosecutor turned advocate, a retired judge seeking redemption, and a self-proclaimed outsider who refused to let injustice go unchallenged. Karoline found herself at the center of attention, something she hadn't anticipated or particularly wanted. But she handled it with grace, using interviews as opportunities to educate others about systemic inequities. Edward, inspired by the trial's success, decided to dedicate more of his career to fighting similar battles across the country. He started reaching out to organizations focused on civil rights and environmental justice, eager to lend his skills where they were needed most. Though he would miss working closely with Karoline, he knew their partnership had changed him for the better. As for Judge Grayson, he announced his retirement shortly after the trial, but instead of disappearing into obscurity, he chose to mentor young lawyers and advocate for judicial reform. He gave lectures at local universities, sharing lessons learned from his decades on the bench and mistakes made along the way. His transformation from rigid enforcer to compassionate ally became a source of inspiration for many. Karoline returned to her quiet life, though it wasn't quite the same as before. People around town greeted her warmly, thanking her for standing up when no one else dared. Strangers stopped her in the grocery store to express gratitude, and neighbors invited her to community meetings, eager to hear her thoughts on future initiatives. Despite the newfound recognition, she remained grounded, focusing on how she could continue making a difference without losing sight of who she was. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Karoline walked through the streets of the town she had come to call home. She passed the courthouse, pausing briefly to look at its familiar facade. It was here that her journey had begun, not just as someone challenging an unfair law, but as someone rediscovering her passion for justice. She thought back to the day she stood before Judge Grayson, arguing against a seemingly trivial fine. At the time, she hadn't imagined it would lead to this moment, a moment where entire systems were being questioned and reimagined. Her Coss, which had once been seen as eccentric or rebellious, now symbolized something greater: the power of individual courage to spark collective change. Continuing her walk, Karoline reached the edge of town, where open fields stretched endlessly under the fading light. She smiled faintly, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she was ready. There were still fights to be fought, voices to amplify, and truths to uncover. And if there was one thing she had learned, it was that even the smallest act of defiance could ignite a movement. Turning back toward her house, Karoline quickened her pace, already thinking about the next challenge waiting to be tackled. Whatever came next, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. Together, with allies like Edward, Judge Grayson, and countless others, they would keep pushing forward, one step at a time, until justice truly served everyone equally. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, Karoline stepped into the future, leaving behind a legacy that proved even the most ordinary moments could give rise to extraordinary change. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity for Edward and Karoline. They spent long hours poring over documents, drafting motions, and strategizing about how to present their case in court. Their partnership quickly evolved into something deeper, a shared mission to expose the injustices hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and legal jargon. As they dug deeper into the zoning laws at the heart of the lawsuit, they began uncovering patterns that went beyond mere discrimination. It wasn't just about race or socioeconomic status, it was about control. The ordinances had been crafted in a way that allowed certain groups to maintain power while pushing others to the margins. What started as a straightforward civil rights case was turning into something much bigger, an investigation into systemic corruption. Karoline's sharp eye caught details that Edward might have overlooked. She noticed inconsistencies in official records, suspiciously timed policy changes, and connections between city officials and private developers. Each discovery added another piece to the puzzle, painting a clearer picture of a town riddled with unethical practices. One evening, after yet another marathon session at Karoline's house, Edward leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. "This is insane," he muttered. "Every time we think we've hit the bottom, there's another layer." Karoline nodded, her expression grim. "That's how these things work. They bury the truth so deep that most people don't even bother looking for it, but now that we've started, we can't stop." Edward sighed. "You're right, but how do we prove all this? Even if we file a motion, the judge might dismiss it before we get a chance to present our evidence." "That's why we need to be smart," Karoline replied. "We don't just throw everything at them at once. We build a narrative. Slowly, carefully. Let them see the cracks in their own system before we tear it down." Her words gave Edward a sense of direction, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into dangerous territory. Challenging powerful figures always came with risks, and neither of them was naive enough to believe they'd emerge unscathed. Still, there was no turning back now. Meanwhile, Judge Harold Grayson found himself unable to forget the young woman who had stood confidently in his courtroom just weeks earlier. Karoline Leavitt's arguments had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, a nagging question about whether he had done the right thing by fining her. He tried to push the thought aside, telling himself that he had followed the law to the letter. But the more he reflected on the case, the more uneasy he became. Judge Grayson had always prided himself on being fair and impartial. Yet as he reviewed transcripts from recent trials, he began to notice troubling patterns. Certain defendants received harsher sentences than others for similar offenses, Evidence was sometimes ignored or dismissed without explanation. And then there were the ordinances themselves, vague, outdated, and often used as tools to target specific groups. He decided to dig deeper, starting with the ordinance that had landed Karoline in his courtroom. To his surprise, he discovered that it had been introduced decades ago during a period of social unrest. Its original intent had been to suppress protests and limit public gatherings, not regulate clothing. Over time, however, its meaning had been twisted to justify increasingly petty enforcement actions. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. For years, he had blindly upheld laws without questioning their origins or implications. Now, faced with undeniable evidence of their flaws, he felt a pang of guilt and a growing determination to make things right. Back at Karoline's house, she and Edward were putting the finishing touches on their filing when a knock at the door interrupted them. Startled, Karoline glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Who could possibly be visiting at this hour? She opened the door cautiously, only to find Judge Grayson standing on her porch. His usually stern face looked weary, almost vulnerable. Before she could say anything, he spoke. "Ms. Leavitt," he began, his voice low and hesitant. I owe you an apology." Karoline blinked, taken aback. "Your Honor? I misjudged you," he continued. "When you appeared in my courtroom, I dismissed your arguments because I thought you were just trying to avoid responsibility. But I was wrong. You were speaking the truth, and I didn't listen." For a moment, Karoline didn't know what to say. She stepped aside and invited him in, gesturing for him to sit at the kitchen table where piles of legal documents were scattered everywhere. Edward watched silently, unsure of what to make of the unexpected visitor. "Why are you here, Judge?" Karoline asked finally, her tone neutral but curious. Grayson hesitated before answering. "Because I want to help. After your trial, I started looking into the ordinances we enforce in this town. What I found disturbed me. These laws aren't about protecting the public. They're about controlling it, and I've been complicit in that." Edward exchanged a glance with Karoline. Neither of them had expected this turn of events. "If you're serious about helping," Karoline said slowly, "then you need to understand what we're up against. This isn't just about one bad law or one corrupt official. It's about a system designed to serve the few at the expense location of the many." Grayson nodded solemnly. "I know. That's why I'm here. If you'll let me, I'd like to assist in any way I can." Karoline studied him for a long moment, weighing his sincerity. Finally, she extended her hand. "Welcome to the team, Your Honor." With Judge Grayson's unexpected alliance, the trio intensified their efforts. They divided tasks based on their strengths. Edward handled logistics and communication with clients. Karoline focused on crafting legal arguments, and Grayson provided insider knowledge about the inner workings of the judicial system. Their collaboration yielded results, faster than they had anticipated. Using Grayson's insights, they identified key witnesses who could testify about the impact of the zoning laws on marginalized communities. Karoline devised a strategy to highlight these testimonies during the trial, ensuring that the human cost of the policies would take center stage. Meanwhile, Edward worked tirelessly to gather affidavits and other supporting evidence. As the trial date approached, tensions ran high. Rumors spread around town about the lawsuit, drawing both support and backlash. Some residents praised Karoline and her team for taking a stand, while others accused them of stirring up trouble. Anonymous threats began appearing online, targeting Karoline specifically. Despite the pressure, she remained unfazed, channeling her energy into preparing for the courtroom battle ahead. On the eve of the trial, the three of them gathered at Karoline's house for one final review of their case. The air was thick with anticipation, but also with a quiet resolve. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were ready. "You've done incredible work," Grayson said, breaking the silence. "Both of you. I'm proud to be part of this." Edward smiled, faintly. "Let's hope the judge agrees." Karoline chuckled. "Don't worry, by the time we're done, they won't have a choice." As they packed up their materials and prepared to leave, Caroline paused by the window, gazing out at the darkened streets. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose, a belief that change was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Whatever happened tomorrow, she knew they had already made a difference, and with that thought she turned off the light and headed to bed, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead.